All right, good to see everybody. Welcome. We are going to continue in our study tonight of the scenes in which Jesus interacted with people and taking a look at his behaviors and decision-making, as we said, understanding what motivated him, why he did these things, and certainly then what it is that we can learn from that. What it is that we see in him, even in these moments like what we're talking about now, of amazing, miraculous power, principles that we can take from that, and that's the goal of what we're doing here. And so we'll continue on. We're going to be looking at a few different passages tonight, continuing in our conversation from last week. And then I hope you've seen we're trying to keep some themes going here that I'm trying to introduce. A couple of things that we're going to continue to touch on. One is how all of these things establish principles of how we are to behave in the kingdom. When we looked at Matthew 5 and the expectations of what a person in the kingdom acts like, how Jesus pointed to those in his behaviors. And the other thing we're going to look at is what the overarching principles of salvation are and how those also play in, and that Jesus was also trying to teach core principles of redemption and salvation that I think we're going to see as a thread through all of these things. So we're going to continue with that tonight, and we will, as we mentioned a week ago, now look at his power in raising people from the dead. We have some examples of that we're going to look at now as we go through somewhat chronologically. All right, let's bow and pray, and then we'll begin. Father in heaven, we're thankful to you for all the blessings you give us. We're thankful for your church and for this time that we have to be together, and that we in this country can be together in peace, and that we can encourage each other and honor you in the things we do. We are thankful for the blessings we have, that you have given us good lives and that you've given us good things, but we're thankful more than anything for your Son, Jesus Christ. We're thankful for his sacrifice. We're thankful for the example that you have recorded and that we can learn from, and we're thankful that he intercedes for us and that he knows about us and that you love us. And we're thankful that you gave us this example and that you have mercy on us and that you give us this guidance. And we ask you that you would help us to be servants, that we would do good for others, and that we would exemplify the things that Jesus taught. We pray all these things in his name, and amen. So last time, if you don't remember, we looked at Jesus as he started to go, and he was just traveling around, certainly intentionally, and the crowds were following him, and they were pressing in on him. In fact, one of the things we looked at was even when they were crowded around and they went and sat down and they were needing food, and how he produced food for them. In that case, we start to get an idea of the quantity. What's the best idea we have about how many people were following him around in this case? Maybe 10,000 people. I mean, when you think about that number of people, maybe 20 times the number of people that sit in this auditorium following him around. And even in some of the examples we're going to see today, we see that they're pressing in on him and that they're really energetic. And so we saw some of those examples. Then we looked at how he encountered a man with leprosy and that he healed the man of leprosy. And why did we say, what was his motivation to heal the man of leprosy to the best of our knowledge? Yeah, he felt he wanted to give mercy to this person, to give him relief. It says the man begged him. It begged him, and another indicator we had there was that he did it and then said, "Tell no one." The centurion came to him, an unlikely person to come, and once again came to him because he had a servant that was, it says, lying paralyzed at home, terribly tormented. And once again, he begged, he asked, and Jesus responded with compassion. We walked in, and I know we don't know the whole scenario, but we know he walked in and saw Peter's mother-in-law. And it's a very short little story we have here, but he said as he came into the home and saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever, and he touched her, and that she was healed at this moment. And in this case, it says in verse 17, this happened so that what was spoken through Isaiah, the prophet, would be fulfilled. He himself took our illnesses and carried away our diseases. And we looked at that. We looked at Isaiah 53, and though it is most certainly a picture of a suffering Savior, of a Messiah who suffered, it was designed that he did these things for what purpose? Why is it that our Savior suffered? Okay, because of love. He has love for us. Well, take that a step further. He loves us, so he was willing to endure suffering. Isaiah 53 even kind of alludes to this, but why did he do these things? It says because he was taking burdens from us. The love is most certainly the motivator. But when we read Isaiah 53, when we read what we see here in Matthew 8, he is going around and lifting burdens off of people and putting them on him. And I think we all can recognize how that connects into the ultimate burden being relieved of eternal death. And that's obviously where we're headed here. But I want to make sure we keep looking back at that principle, because when we see that he healed Peter's mother-in-law, it says it was to fulfill Isaiah 53, which is all about the Savior taking our burdens, taking our pain, taking our diseases, and relieving of those. So I hope that even though it's a simple concept, that when you think of Jesus performing miraculous acts, that you will directly connect those to the relief of burdened people, the relief of pain in people. Now, so we asked that question last time also. Why is it, this is where we ended last time, why did God choose for this Son on earth to perform these acts of power as a demonstration? Why is it, and we obviously know the basics of why they were recorded, where we know that they were recorded so that we would read them and we would believe. But why select removing leprosy from a person, or taking away paralyzation, or sickness or fever? Why would God do those things as a demonstration of his deity, of his Son's deity? And we talked about that a little last time. And the key principle here is that Jesus is walking around, and in many cases, not in a flashy way, quietly interacting with people, and he is exemplifying the principles of the kingdom. He is taking people who are sad and burdened and disenfranchised and sick and in a minute dead, and he is relieving them of that. The key principle of the kingdom is bringing peace and removing burdens from people. Restoration is the key to the kingdom. And so we talked about that. He could have done all kinds of other things. God could have done any type of amazing demonstration. You know, 4th of July, we watch fireworks in the sky. Just fireworks in the sky would have blown people's minds. Some type of cosmic thing in the sky, some type of parting of the Red Sea type of event. But no, what he did was Jesus went around, and I had a person approach me after class and made a really good point that said he's making it personal. That now it is not a generic religion that's going on. Jesus is demonstrating that the kingdom of God is about interactions with people, helping and serving and relieving people of burdens at a personal level. And Jesus was the best at it in history. So just wanted to remind us of those conversations about that. To me, I will admit that when I first started to study for this class, I was concerned that Jesus performing miraculous acts would be extremely hard to attach to what would Jesus do in our lives. That how do we go about applying that? But I hope I don't even have to explain how, though we don't have the miraculous gifts of healing, how what Jesus is doing in the demonstration of mercy and compassion and relief is very certainly something we can emulate. And so I hope you see that as we go along. So let's look now as we continue on as Jesus goes around. Let's start with Luke 7. And now we're going to amp it up. And now we see that Jesus has been healing people of these illnesses. And now we see these three examples. We'll look at Luke 7, Luke 8, and John 11. We see examples of Jesus and his dealing with people who've died or who are dying. So in Luke 7, verse 11, we see, and I realize that these scenarios we're going to study are ones you're very familiar with, but we'll go through them and try to learn from them. So Luke 7 and verse 11, soon afterwards he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. As we mentioned, thousands of people perhaps, but everywhere he went there were people crowded. Now as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd was with her. I do not think it was unnecessary detail that when this was documented, it told us some things about this person, that he came in and a dead person was being carried out. What are some details we know about this person who died? Only son of a widow. So this was not just, these weren't just thrown in facts. This is us understanding why this happened, why Jesus gave this his attention. The only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. The Lord saw her. He felt compassion for her. He said to her, "Do not weep." And he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back his mother. Just how amazing that was, the way that's written. But these are just one of those things where it's written well, so we can kind of visualize the scene in our heads. But this is one of the more detailed explanations of this. In fact, this one and then the one we'll see in Luke 8, that he felt compassion and just said, "Don't cry." You just can imagine that he spoke to her with mercy and just said, "Don't cry." He had emotional feeling for her, knowing that this was her only son and that she had had a difficult life. And it says when he touched the coffin, the people that were carrying it stopped, and he sat up and began to speak. I think I will admit that I have learned these stories I've learned these stories from the moment I could think. And so I suspect I do not feel the bone-chilling impact of a dead person coming out of a coffin and starting to talk. I think maybe we've seen enough movies too where we are desensitized to it. But I think we have to understand that this was a jaw-dropping moment in time where they saw this happen and recognized power. Yes, Mark.
Something else from the standpoint of Judaism is that there's this idea of uncleanness that Jesus is directly kind of challenging.
Yeah.
They're bringing this coffin out of the city because you don't put it.
Yeah, you need to get them out. Yeah.
Get them out. So they were walking, and Jesus comes up, and what does he do? He goes up and touches
Yeah.
the coffin. That would have been unheard of, number one, right?
Absolutely.
There. And so I wonder if part of the reason that they stopped was,
What's he doing?
we've just contaminated
Yes.
somebody else outside the city.
And we're going to see that even more here in a moment when the story of Jairus' daughter is interrupted by the woman with the hemorrhage. And we see, okay, this is flying in the face of what these people thought was proper and clean in society. But this whole scene was just crazy to them. And he sat up and began to speak, and I love how it says, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. That it's just almost like this presentation of, here's your son back. Yes?
Also, having a son, he was the breadwinner
Yeah.
of the family. And being a widow, then she would be on her own. And in this society,
It wasn't...
there's nothing.
It wasn't just that a beloved person had died. It was that her livelihood had died and her ability to subsist in society had died. So it was even worse than just a beloved son dying. And it says the outcome was fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God. So just the outcome we've talked about in this class multiple times, that the idea of participating in the kingdom is letting our light shine before men. It's letting our light shine before men so that what? They may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. That process is so important. Jesus is exemplifying it. Letting light shine, that good works are seen, and the outcome is glorification of God. They saw this. I think their blood ran cold when they saw what had happened here. That's when I hear fear gripped them. Have you felt that before? Where you just felt a shock go through you? And it says they began glorifying God. It says a great prophet is risen among us. God has visited his people. And it says this report concerning him went all over Judea and in all the surrounding district. Now, for us, we see that written, and even especially when we get to the story of Lazarus, when we start hearing that it went out and the stories of this started to go out among Judea and the surrounding district, that's a great thing. But there's a bad side to that too in this process, because the more it gets spread around, and Jesus obviously knew this, there is this dark, there's kind of this dark cloud out there that we know that it's going to start stirring up trouble with the religious leaders. Yeah.
The crowd was with Jesus, could have been thousands, and then the funeral procession.
Yeah. With her. Yeah.
And so
What an impact.
groups meet, and again, touch that coffin, the gasp throughout the crowd, and they went quiet. And then to have the son get up, and again, all through these things, the Jews knew when you were dead.
Yes. Yeah, they knew how to tell. Yeah, this wasn't an accidental, that oops, we thought he was dead, but he wasn't. They were very careful about that, and we're going to see other examples of that. Especially with Lazarus, they had proof that he had died, and so that this what you just said is extremely important. That we're starting to get ripples now. He starts off, we see the wedding at Cana, quietly, doesn't want it told. Other times, tell no one. But now we're starting to see these ripples come out. Luke 8 and verse 40, let's look there as we kind of continue in this, as Jesus goes around and just doing good. He's going around and doing good. Yes, Don. It's such an important point, isn't it, that he wasn't healing large groups of people or performing acts across large groups of people. He was zeroing in on the need and the pain, and he cared about that individual. And that widow was his focus. And so it's so important to see that even though there was a crowd, he was still performing these personal acts of goodness. Certainly what we're going to see in Luke 8 and in John 11 are right along that same path. Luke 8, in verse 40, as Jesus returned, the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet, began to implore him to come to his house. Once again, we see someone coming and just begging Jesus. And I don't mean to belittle this at all, but it worked. When people came and begged Jesus with sincerity, it works because he sees their sincerity. And it says it began to implore him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. So this is another scenario in which we see Jairus begging for his only daughter, and the 12-year-old, you just think about a 12-year-old child and the sweetness and innocence of a 12-year-old child. When it gets to like 14 to 18, no, that doesn't fall in the same category. For 12, that's precious. And so you have this 12-year-old child here, only child, and it says, as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. Once again, we see this people all around. Jairus comes down and implores him. Now, what an interesting tangent now that we see that Jairus has come to Jesus and said, come to my house, my only 12-year-old daughter is dying. And then there is a distraction. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. We've seen sometimes it written that she had tried for 12 years, spent everything she owned to try to resolve this situation. But this person with a hemorrhage came up and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And so this idea now that she came up and touched him, Mark already ruined this, but the idea that this touching, that she came up, and what would be the problem with a person in this crowd who had what we call an issue of blood or a flow of blood or a hemorrhage, hemophilia, what's that? Yes, blood, a person bleeding. This is a person who causes others to be unclean with their touch. That this is a person, and besides it is gross. This is a hard thing to see. It's gross and it is unclean, and that it made other people unclean. And so, of course, now we've gone through a time period in this country where we had a sickness that was extremely contagious in our country. And we had to, even though it wasn't spiritual uncleanness, we started their 6 foot. We remember the time. I mean, have we already forgotten about the time where we were afraid to touch people? And that we were concerned when we touched a thing. I will admit, when I did go to the store and brought it home, I had the thought, is there sickness on this? And we know kind of that idea of touching and sickness, and the idea of a person having this uncleanness and making you spiritually unclean was well known and dangerous. Yes, Mark?
And I think maybe to emphasize that point, it is super important, because what Jesus really did with all of these things is he exploded the boundaries of uncleanness, meaning that the normal reaction to something like any of these things happening was everybody stops and you isolate the person who's unclean. They have to go through some kind of purification thing before they can even get back in society. But that didn't have to happen, because Jesus was willing to basically eliminate that which made somebody unclean.
Well, and that's the whole process here of that, and the curse of the law and the fact that we are incapable of keeping it. That's a curse. But also the actual law itself created the rituals and requirements of that itself were a curse. So this idea of Jesus flies in the face of that, because just the simple thought here. The idea was that if a person who was unclean or had an unclean sickness touched you, it made you unclean. Well, Jesus came up and touched her. What happened? Did it make him unclean? What happened? He made her clean. That's how powerful this moment is. That this wasn't now this idea of an unclean person making Jesus unclean. It is that touching him makes them clean. Yes?
She touched Jesus. Jesus didn't touch her.
Yes, and isn't it important that she touched she came and touched the hem of the garment, and that reached out and touched it, and I can't explain to you. I've probably taught before and heard before teachings about this process of how he felt the power come out of him. We know that happened. Who touched me? He says. And of course, the response of the disciples when he said, "Who touched me?" was what? Okay, listen. Yes, everybody touched you. This is a crowd of people all smashed together. And he said, "Someone did touch me. I was aware that the power had gone out of me." That's how much power Jesus exuded. By touching his garment, a person of faith has power heal them, and that Jesus made that person clean. It says, immediately the hemorrhage stopped. And when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him. So now she thinks she's really done it. Now she's caught, because she was clearly sneaking in the crowd. She did not want people knowing what was going on. And she fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him. Now, I believe that there is a whole nother set of compassion that happens here. That not just did Jesus almost unknowingly make this person clean, but now she comes to him and is sad and broken and scared and says, she told the reason why she had touched him and how she had immediately been healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." So he connects now. You notice that he doesn't say, "Daughter, I have healed you. Go in peace." He could have said that. It's true. What did he connect the healing to? Her faith. And so isn't that so important now that he doesn't come out and say, "Okay, you stole one. You got one by touching me, and you got healed." He said, "Your faith has made you well." Yes.
I venture to guess that he probably already knew that was her. But just not enough
Yeah, I think it's hard for us to ever in these scenarios think that he was ignorant of something, or that he, even when we talked about him sleeping on the boat, it wasn't because he didn't know a storm was happening. You can't ever attach something to Jesus not knowing, but perhaps times he didn't. But what she said was, Jesus knew what was going on. This was an opportunity for him now to connect this cleansing to faith. And I do not think we should just bounce over the fact that he said, "Go in peace." I'm going to reiterate. I believe that every one of these things Jesus was doing was a demonstration of bringing peace and quietness and healing and pain relief to people. And so she had spent 12 years in agony, 12 years in desperate agony. And in this moment of touching the hem of his garment, peace came to her that Jesus delivered to her. Isaiah 9:6, unto you a child is born, he shall be called Wonderful Counselor. What else is he called? Do you know that verse? He's called Wonderful Counselor. He is called Prince of Peace. Now, I believe, I think certainly during this holiday season, we talk about Prince of Peace, and that our hope is that Jesus will bring peace to the world. And I believe that that's certainly a outcome we would like, that we want Jesus to bring peace to the world. But what Jesus does is he brings peace to people, that he is the Prince of bringing peace to people's lives, not just in spiritual salvation, but in making their lives better. And so he said, "Your faith has made you well, go in peace." Now, remember that right before this, Jairus had come to him and said, "Please come to my house. My daughter is dying." And I can only imagine that Jairus was standing on the sideline of this scene and thinking, can we go to the house thing? I would love for us to, can we get an answer to that? And so while he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." So what a terrible moment. Certainly amazing moment with the healing of this woman. But as he's speaking, they come and say to Jairus, "Don't bother him anymore. Just, your daughter has died." So what did that indicate when they came to him and said, "Don't bother the teacher anymore"? What does that tell you about what they thought? Yes, they thought there were some limits here. And it was because all of this was so new. They thought, well, he couldn't get there in time to touch her and heal her with this method. And so they said, "Don't bother him anymore." And Jesus heard that and answered, "Do not be afraid." Once again, do not be afraid any longer. I just love how I will admit, I skipped over these things when I've read these things in the past, that Jesus says, "Do not be afraid." He's trying to bring peace to this person. Don't be afraid any longer. Only believe, and she will be made well. Once again, this connection of have faith, and she will be made well. He has already felt compassion for him. He has seen his sincerity. He says, "Believe that I can do this, and she will be made well." And it says then that he came to the house, and this is another scene in which he does not do it in front of the crowd. He did not allow anyone to enter except for Peter and John and James and the girl's father and mother. So he just wanted this to be a very close-knit group of people because he was focused on the person. He was focused on the need. They were all weeping and lamenting for her, but he said, "Stop weeping, for she has not died, but she is asleep." clearly using a turn of phrase here a little bit, because the reaction was they began laughing at him. And this goes back to what you were saying, Neil. They knew she had died. They know what dead is. And so they laughed and said, he said she's asleep, but they knew she had died. And he took her hand and called, saying, "Child, arise." Her spirit returned, and she got up immediately. So once again, we don't see a healing that Jesus does, which is a process, of, okay, you're going to start feeling better over time, and then eventually he heals them, and they are getting up. They're sitting up in a coffin and talking. In this case, it says her spirit returned, and she got up immediately, and he gave orders for something to be given for her to eat. It's almost like she's an alive person now. Feed her, and that because this is a living person now. Her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. What was his motivation for doing this for Jairus' daughter? Why did he heal Jairus' daughter? Compassion, love for them, love for people who are hurting. I think I want, by the way, I want a God and a Savior who responds to pleading. How sad would it be if we did not feel like our emotional appeals to God were not effective? We even learn about prayer, that one of the most direct teachings about the effectiveness of prayer is persistence, is continuing. And so in this case, I think we see he was asked in an impassioned way. He felt compassion for the situation. His abilities were questioned. And he just wanted to take a situation and relieve people of pain. And it was not, obviously he was trying to control them. He was trying to control the rhetoric right now. He did not want this thing blowing up too much and getting out of control before he wanted it to. So he was controlling the message. But he was not motivated here by trying to make a show. He did just the opposite. Yes, Neil?
Not that it had any lasting effect, but now he has a religious leader
Yes.
on his side.
Yes, and so we see examples of just simple people, a centurion, a leader in the synagogue. We see now all these different people of different walks of life now, and he's showing compassion to every single one of them. Jew, Gentile, rich, poor, powerful, weak, all of them. And the message is the salvation of the kingdom is not attached to any of those things. It is totally independent of those things. We'll do the short version of Lazarus, but then next time I'm going to ask you a question, and next time we're going to talk about this question. What is the connection of Jesus raising people from the dead and what we learn about God's redemption? Jesus is going to say something here very powerful as he interacts with Martha and Mary and the others in Bethany. And it is because he is directly connecting what he is doing here to God's plan for his kingdom. So I'm going to read, this is really a long writing here, and so I think you know this, but I'm going to read some of the key sections here. Certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. We know Jesus went to this city frequently. We know that he knew them very well. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." But when Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, and that the Son of God may be glorified by it." So we see a message sent to him that Lazarus, the person he loves, relative of these people that he's very close to, it says that he is sick. And his response, this is a close friend, these are close friends. His response is to do what? Rush to them, go, and by the way, we've already learned he doesn't have to go there. He could resolve it in any way he wants. But instead, he waits for a number of days and says, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified. Go ahead, Neil. Oh, did I not tell you John 11? I just started reading, so yeah. So John 11, verse 1 is where I was. So thanks for asking. So he says, it's very curious, isn't it? Because it does end in death as far as they're concerned. And so he says it's not to end in death, but he says that the goal here is, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified by it. That this is what's really happening here, is that this is a scene in which God will be glorified and the Son of God may be glorified by it. So we know he waits and doesn't go immediately. In verse 17 of John 11, so when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. So he didn't just, let me say this. If for those of you who've had a loved one die, 4 days is an eternity, is it not? The day they die and the days following it, slow motion. And so 4 days is a long time for him to be dead and for them to believe he is dead forever. Jesus comes to them in just abject mourning. And it says, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she'd heard Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now we know here in a few verses later, Mary comes to him and says what to him? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, I cannot interpret the tone of what they were saying here. I don't know if it was they were close friends of his and they were saying, listen, if you had just been here, this wouldn't have happened. I hope not. I don't know. It could have been just a recognition of his power, that's saying, he has died now. It would have been great if you had been here because he wouldn't be dead. I don't know what exactly. But we see that they certainly don't question his power. They just know that if he had been there, he would not have died. And it says, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give this to you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. So there was Martha even kind of hinted. It was the first time I know of that somebody thought he could raise a person from the dead that said that. Like even now, I think that whatever you want, God will give it to you. And he says, your brother will rise again. And then what is her interpretation of that? Yeah, so she says, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Still, so she almost kind of hints at what he can do when he says he will rise again. There seems to be this dialogue like, maybe he's saying he has died, but just like we do when we comfort a person who's lost a loved one, you'll see them again someday. We'll be with them again one day. Perhaps that's what she interpreted. And his statement here, which I want us to spend some time on next class, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And he says to her, do you believe this? I want us to ask that exact question when we're together next time. Our time is almost up, but next time I want you to think about this. When he says, I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. That's a hard thing to believe. Now, we obviously see this in context. We study it in Bible classes. But imagine standing next to the tomb of your dead friend and being taught this lesson about believing in him and never dying. And she said to him, in response to, do you believe this? Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. So she connects that immediately to, I believe what you're saying because you are the Christ, you're the Son of God. Now I want to finish up the recording of this here, and then we'll come back to that because I really want to dig in about what he told her here, because it's clearly connected to what he said when he said that this will not end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now, we cut forward to verse 32. Martha sends Mary. Therefore, when Mary came to where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And then verse 35, Jesus wept. He came into this, this group of people, and it was Martha and Mary weeping. And it says the Jews came also weeping. And what does it say was the impact on him? It says he was deeply moved and troubled and that he wept. That same kind of terminology reminds us of that extremely emotional response in the garden where he was just deeply grieved. That I think we all have been through a time where we were just fearful and sad and desperate to the core. Like we were just utterly moved by something emotionally. And so we'll ask this question as well next time. Like what Dariel said a minute ago, he knows things. Yet he is weeping and deeply troubled. He knows the power, perhaps already has the plan that he is going to raise this friend from the dead. But we need to ask the question, why was he so sad and grieved? And so that's the first thing we'll ask when we begin next time. And then we want to look at this idea of after Jesus raises him, what is the connection of this to Jesus being the resurrection and the life? We're going to look at a dozen verses that talk about Jesus being life and that he is resurrection from the dead. We're going to look at why is it that this Jesus chose to connect to that. So our time is up. We'll continue this on Wednesday, but I really appreciate your input tonight. But think about those things. How Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Why Jesus responded with such emotion to all these situations when he knew he had the power to relieve them. We'll talk about that on Wednesday. Thank you for your input.